Glad to see you here. We're going to see the Osborns back from a long travel, other end of the country. Beautiful sunshiny day out there today, and maybe it'll get up over 40 degrees today. That's good. Maybe melt some of the snow out there. But again, welcome to our class today. Again, on integrity. This is a series that I've taken from Andy Stanley's sermon series and turned it into a class. And again, the key thing is your integrity, our world. My integrity, your world. Your integrity, my world. It affects us all. That's kind of the thing we need to keep in mind. Need the clicker. My quote for today. The supreme quality for leadership is unquestionably integrity. Without it, no real success is possible, no matter whether it is on a section gang, a football team, in an army, or in an office. And that was a quote by Dwight D. Eisenhower. I think most of us know who he was here. Who were in a kids class might be a little bit different, but so we see how I'm trying to find quotes from different people, and we see that how other people actually reflect on integrity and see the importance of it as well. But if you recall, last week, we'll do a quick little review here because we didn't quite finish up. But last week, we talked about appetites, right? And how appetites pose a constant threat to our integrity, right? So we either at times have to say no to an appetite to maintain our integrity, or we have to say no to integrity in order to satisfy our appetite. If you recall, there was a number of appetites we talked about. This was a list, like acceptance, intimacy. There's a whole bunch of things that we can consider to be appetite, not just food. Because an appetite is something that wants now. It's something that we crave and that gets in the way of things. In fact, if you recall, there was three little points that I made. One of them was that we as Christians, we can safely say that God created them and sin distorted them. If you remember that. Everybody, no matter who, whether they're Christian or not, will believe that appetites are never full or finally satisfied. We always want, remember the one word, more. Appetites, that's what they say. They want more. And as well, appetites always whisper now, never later. Or as we've seen in our text last week, quick. That's what an appetite is always telling us, isn't it? And it never says, wait till tomorrow. It wants it now, right? And we talked about the story of Jacob and Esau, remember? And again, this is kind of odd because, we always notice Jacob and Esau. If you look in your Bible, that's what the text uses, the heading says, Jacob and Esau. But actually, Esau was older than Jacob. And Esau had something called a birthright, which was very, very important in those days. a lot of respect, a lot of dignity, a lot of family history, a lot of things that went along with that. And if you remember the story, we started back in Genesis 25, 27 through 34. You don't have to turn there, actually. But remember, the boys grew up, and Esau was a skillful hunter. He was the man of the open country, while Jacob continued to stay at home among the tents, if you were to read the text. And of course, Isaac loved Esau, his dad, and Rebekah loved Jacob. Well, one day when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the country, and he said, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." Remember, we talked about that. And Jacob replied, "Well, first, some of your birthright, You think, what? What in the world would that? Why in the world would they be doing that, Remember, Esau's whole future, all his power, his reputation, everything, his respect, came from that birthright, right? What Esau should have said is something that, we'd say, well, what would we say? I'll never do that. No way. Of course, again, he started right at the top. But, of course, he was so hungry and he was so wanting that appetite that he said, okay. He said, look, I'm about to die. And, of course, we tend to do this. We want to justify something. Look, if I want this, you're going to come up with some sort of a thing. Look, he was just out hunting. He wasn't, there was nothing that could prove that he was about to die. But he did say, what good is my birthright to me? And then we added the two words, right now. Again, we tend to look now, if you remember, the description of integrity is straight, someone who's standing up, someone upright, not looking down, not what's wanting right now. But we tend to have appetites that get in the way and want it right now. So we added the right now, which is really probably what he was thinking. But Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore to him on an oath, and he sold, or he gave him his birthright. Of course, again, Jacob was thinking, it's not worth anything to me right now, right? That's later. The stuff that was going to come in his birthright was going to come later, after, maybe many years when his father had passed away. That's when that would come into play. He didn't see the importance of it right then. And remember what we said, the integrity of the upright will guide them. Well, he wasn't using that, was he? Now, and I said, have you ever found yourself in a situation similar? Maybe you had a parent or a grandparent or an older sibling or a spouse or someone close to you, and they ask you this question: have you really thought through that? Have you really thought through that decision you're about to make there? And of course, again, this justification. Oh yeah, I don't really care. We see that Esau, I don't really care. I'm more interested in this bowl of stew. Remember, that was that word thing. Are we going to sell our birthright for just a bowl of stew? Are we willing to do that? Well, of course, he sold it. So Jacob gave Esau some bread. Well, he was kind of nice. He went even a little further. Gave him some bread along with some lentil stew, and he ate and he drank. And he got up and he left. And his birthright was gone. The stew was gone. And that was the end of that. Was that a good trade, we wonder? Was that really a good trade? Thing is, we usually decide that we don't care when it's too late to care, isn't it? We tend to want to, we'll justify whatever we need to do. We make up our own narrative. That wasn't really a big deal. I mean, that birthright's no big deal. What was more important right now was this stew. That was more important. And of course, remember, earlier he said, well, look, I'm about to die. I need this. I mean, we come up with whatever excuses we can find to try to justify what we're doing, And in our own worlds, what else could I have done, We come up and say, I would have lost my job if I didn't do that, What else could I have done? She never would have gone out with me, or he never would have gone out with me before if I hadn't have done this, What else could I have done? I didn't have any other choice. And that's kind of why Esau looked at it like, he acted like he didn't have any other choice. And if you remember how this whole story ends, it says Esau despised his birthright. He ended up saying, oh, geez, not only did I not want it, I don't really care. It's not worth anything at all. Not worth anything at all to me, And again, if you read the whole story in the Bible, you'll see the whole section of that Jacob's bargaining power, his deceit, and Esau's short-sightedness sets into motion a series of events that would rip through this family for decades. It ends up not just about the two brothers anymore, but about all of their relatives as well. Roger.
This time period I'm confident that there is a law in the land from Adam on. This is not Jewish law yet because it doesn't exist, or the Hebrews. God basically makes Abraham a Jew at some point, but my point is that all of this birthright stuff, I don't believe it came from God. If somebody can find me a scripture, it's the custom of these families at this time, and that's what they did.
Right.
So he despised tradition, maybe his family or his father anyway, because the father is the one who gave these things out. By the way, my dad's pretty old school. He's getting up there, and I visited him a while. My wife and I were there, and he refuses to sell. He's got a pretty nice piece of property. It's not for sale. It's yours if you want it. It's going to stay in the family.
Right. Yeah. There's different things that we do and say. Mark over here has got a comment as well. But again, the interesting thing, the whole point of this and that word thing is, what in the world would we sell? What in the world would we do for a bowl of stew? That's simple.
In Hebrews 12:16, it's interesting. It's the head note is warnings against refusing God, and at the beginning it says, "Make sure no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau." And at least in the notes in the study Bible says that he was sorry, but not sorry because he disobeyed God or it was a God thing that he had given up. It's just he was sorry.
Yeah.
And so we need to remember that there's some things that are more important than others sometimes and are a God thing.
Exactly.
This occurred to me a few weeks ago when we first talked. Well, when we talked about Esau, Esau's name was actually a part of Isaac's name. In Palestinian culture, you may have heard of Mahmoud Abbas, who is the president of the Palestinian organization. His other name is Abu Mazen, and Abu is father of. His oldest son is Mazen. So he's known as Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen. So Isaac would have been known as Isaac Abu Esau. So when he sold his birthright, he literally changed his father's familiar name.
Interesting. Yeah. I know in the text, if we read before we started, where it said they were born, that Jacob, because as he was coming out, he was holding on to Esau's heel, which meant something to do with why he was holding on to his heel. But anyway, so today we're going to continue on, and we're going to be back in the Old Testament. It's another Old Testament story, but this one hopefully is going to show a contrast to the story of Esau. The fact that in this next story, both men probably had a good idea of what their future was. I think Esau knew what his future was. It wasn't that it was just, well, geez, that was over there. I think it was drilled into him on a regular basis that you are the oldest, and here's what's going to happen, and here's why it's going to happen. They both knew in their heart what they stood for, and what position that they were in. And we see that one of them chose now over later. To have their integrity put on the line, to have it tested, to give them that pop quiz we talked about. I don't think I did a very good job. The example we're going to look at today has also something to do with food, but we're not going to be too much on appetites. But this story here takes place around 605 BC, when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem to cart off some of the articles from the temple and to take them back with him. He was also known for taking back some of the youngest and the brightest men from the royal families that he'd conquered, and to bring them back to indoctrinate them in the ways of the Babylonians, to teach them their language, their culture, their everything, their whole ways. And he would train them up for 3 years to see if they met his requirements, that he could actually come to work, that they could actually be put into service for the king. And this is quite interesting. It's out of Daniel. Hopefully everyone knows the story. This is the fact there's a lot of stories in Daniel I could have used, but we're going to start right back at the very first. So Daniel 1. Daniel 1, 1 through 5. If you want to look at it in your Bible, or it'll be up on the screen. Now realize that when this happened, Daniel was just a teenager. He was probably 16 to 18 years old when this happened. We've all, I'm preaching to the choir here, but if we all know about Nebuchadnezzar and what bad things he did, and this is one of the things that of course happened here. It says in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands. So this is interesting because Andy said, see, what Nebuchadnezzar would do is he would conquer these places, he would take the leaders of the kings or the whatever, and he'd take them back with him, and he said he would blind them, and then at certain times of if they have a feast or something, he'd bring them on out and say, look everybody, look what I have here. This is my catch. This is what I have here. I couldn't find that. Actually, I tried to find some actual biblical on that, but maybe he had some things elsewhere. But this sounds like a pretty bad guy, doesn't he? He wouldn't just kill him; he'd take him back and keep him as a prisoner, and then bring him out and show other people. So in case anyone else wanted to come and deal with him, he's like, well, this guy I guess really knows what he's doing here. He doesn't just take it there. So he continues to make it even worse. So, and again, he would take the articles from the temple, starting in 2, and the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hands, along with some of the articles from the temple to the temple of God, Yahweh. Then he carried off. These things were carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put into the treasure house of his God. And if you notice, I put in there just his God's name was, in the easiest way, is Marduk. Was the God that he created, that he did everything with. Then the king ordered Ashpinzas, chief of the court officials, to bring into the court service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Now that's quite interesting to remember, the royal family and the nobility. He didn't just want to take anyone's. He wanted the cream of the crop, the people the young kids that had been brought up, understand who power is and who is the boss and who were also very learned. They understood things. Again, young men without any physical defects, handsome. He wanted, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. So this was the top, cream of the crop. And he was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. Now, one thing to kind of keep in mind here, if you know much about back then, people back then were basically living in starvation. They were lucky to get one meal a day. This wasn't this is something that we just normally do. Now, these guys being the nobility, of course, they probably didn't just have one meal a day, but still, just the normal general people to say that you're going to get and to eat from the king's table. Most of his servants probably didn't even eat from the king's table. They had some food, but not from the king's table. The king's table was the richest, finest meats, the best wines, the top of the cream of the crop on all of those as well. And I liked how Andy explained this section right here. He said, these young men weren't taken off to work in salt mines or out into the fields. They weren't there for labor. He didn't bring them back and strap them to things and every day send them out and give them a cup of water and bring them back. No, it's like these guys went there for a 100% free scholarship right to an Ivy League college. They were going there to get to be right to the very top, right? Not only did they get to stay probably in or near the palace for free, they got a full platinum meal plan as well. Top of the line, three squares a day, everything that they wanted. And the finest meat, the finest wines the king drank. So that sounds like a pretty good deal, doesn't it? I don't know what they actually had back where they were, but they weren't coming into captivity where they're saying, well, this is a terrible thing that we got into here. And it goes on to say, in 1:5-7, they were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. So it's like going to college for 3 years. They got to be special top dean kids. They were going to be given the best education, the best foods, the best housing, everything. And most likely, it could have been, we're not sure exactly, but it could have been even better than what they had back home in Jerusalem. Now it says, among those who were chosen from Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now the chief official gave them new names, gave them Babylonian names. Daniel, Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego, otherwise known as the original Fab Four, right? So, again, we know these other guys here too, right? Yeah, they come into play quite a bit, don't they? Yeah. Now, why do you think they received new names? Any thoughts? Okay. Okay. Jim said, kind of break up their social network that they had.
Well, I think it was in anticipation of the fact that in 3 years they're going to be the king's servants. They're going to be representatives of the king, and probably the citizens wouldn't take kindly to Jews, Jewish names, being their rulers or their lords or their decision makers. They had to come off as Babylonians. Plus, the name suggests that they're serving Marduk or other gods, and so he's immediately taking away their identity as Jews and trying to change their identity to someone who's dedicated to Babylonian gods.
Okay, great. I think Leanne was next, and then Mike. Oh, you're good? Okay, then Mike, I guess. Give Mike the mic.
The name Daniel means God is my judge, but the name Belteshazzar means Bel is my protector, which is a god.
Right, exactly. So let me ask you this. How many of you have ever got a pet from somebody? Or even the pet store, or you went to a pet adoption and you've got a pet? How many? Yeah, a few. Did they have a name of that? Sometimes they say, for instance, we adopted our dog, and his name was Riley. Riley. It was at a pet, Riley. Well, we took him home. We came up with our own name. We want him to be our dog, right? We don't want to call him someone else's name, right? What does that give? That gives you ownership, doesn't it? We're going to name it. We're going to see how the animal fits in or whatever. And this is now our dog. It's now our name. And you can almost, it's going to be the exact same sort of thing there. John.
And also culturally, to us, all of those names except probably Daniel are odd names, and sometimes hard to pronounce and remember. Because we've got a pretty good set of names, except in Utah with the spellings and things, but we've got names that we're used to. And I even think about Holly with her foreign students coming into the U. They all pick a anglicized name just to make it easier, because a lot of especially the Chinese, you hear these names, you just can't pronounce them. So I think it's a little of that as well, just cultural. It makes it easier for them to assimilate as they're learning the Babylonian language.
Right. Well, all of these are probably good. Again, probably the one main point is that Nebuchadnezzar wanted to prove that he owned them. You're mine now, and because you're mine, just like a pet, I'm gonna rename you. And those were Babylonian names, obviously, as well. These were Babylonian names. Now, again, Daniel wrote all of this. This is the history of Daniel, and you'll see that in times where we don't see their Jewish or their Hebrew names much anymore. But in Daniel, that's all he calls himself is Daniel. I think maybe because it's too long of a name to be writing out the other thing. But it is. It kind of goes back and forth on some of them. But you are now my possession. Nebuchadnezzar said, "You're mine." There's no more. Forget what that was, because it's all gone. And this next verse is probably one of the verses that defines Daniel's character and his integrity. Now remember, he was just a teenager at this point. In 1:8 it says, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way." Now there's two words there, resolved and defiled. We don't hear those too much in our society. But resolve, what comes to mind? What's the definition that comes to mind when you think of the word resolve? Determined. Okay. Yep. Decided. Exactly. Come to a decision. Exactly. Yeah. to fix something, yeah, to fix it exactly. So one of the best definitions I found was resolve, to make a definite and serious decision to do something. To make a definite and serious decision to do something, not just off the cuff. In fact, in other words, he made up his mind, didn't he? Not to defile, but Daniel made up his mind not to defile. What comes to mind when we hear defile? Pollute? Yeah, excellent. Yeah. To pollute himself. Another one, to defile something, to make yourself, to make it dirty or to make it lose its purity. Yeah, yeah. So Daniel made up his mind not to pollute himself with the royal food and the wine. Now, look, hold on, wait. This is some good stuff here, guys. What's Daniel thinking? What in the world would he? Why would he want to have that royal food and wine? What's the problem with that? You think that maybe someone could have come up to him, and we'll see here just a little while because he says we won't. So he probably had a talk with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego about this too. But you think someone said, "Come here, Daniel. This is a good gig you got going on here. Look." And I see you probably have a thing about your God still. I understand, but he's way over there, And Marduk, the God that's here, he's here, and again you got to realize that he understands that this sort of all of this royal food and wine, before it's ever got to the table, to the king's table, it's been sacrificed and blessed by Marduk. Okay. But good. Let's just quit rocking the boat. Let's fit in with the crowd. You bet the other three are saying, "Hey, we don't want to be. This sounds like a good deal, man. When's the last time you had some venison? Probably with all the fancy spices and on it. This sounds like a good deal. Let's just fit in. Don't cause waves." But we see that Daniel made up his mind not to eat and drink the king's food. It's quite interesting because today. This kind of comes into play. When we sit down to a meal, what's one of the first things we do? We bless it, right? And what do we say? What's one of the standard phrases that you may hear in movies or whatever? Bless this food for nourishing and strength of our body, right? I mean, this is nothing. Bless this food for the nourishing strength. It's the kind of prayer that back then was quite literally taken, and it points to a chain of events that the people in that period took very literal. And most people lived, again, like I said, on the brink of starvation. So when they got their food, you can bet that they thanked God for it, And it's quite interesting because this is the kind of the chain of events if we look at it. They believed that God, and if you remember, there was a time, I did a class on the feasts of the Lord. You see how important God made it that they take this time to bring their first fruits and their grain offerings and that and they would do this because God is the one who gave them this, that they needed to thank God for all this. So they believed that God gave them everything. God gave them the food. That good food went into the body. That good food made the body healthy, and that good food will allow you to prosper. If you wanted to follow the proper chain, this is what they believed, that Yahweh, being the one God, food into the body, healthy, prosper. But now realize, we're now in Babylonia. So here's the chain of events. Marduk is who the blessings come from. This is all going to be given from Marduk to the food. He's the one that's blessing the food that's going into the body. That's causing the health, that's causing the prosper. But the problem was that Daniel knew that this food was being blessed by Marduk. And that was the king of Nebuchadnezzar. And he didn't want to have any of what his life was going to be credited and responsible for by Marduk or any of the successes that Daniel may have. So anything good that came from Daniel, they could have said, well, that's because of the blessings from Marduk, This is something that he wasn't going to have that. He wasn't going to go down that road, He wasn't going to have anything that's going to give any credit to Marduk. And it's interesting because, like I said, maybe those Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego kind of came to him again and says, look, we don't know really what you're doing here. We can see there has to be some, they came and to our temple, took everything, they besieged us. And that was all because of, Marduk probably blessed them to do that. There's a lot of probably talk going on here that, this was all because of Marduk. They took our leaders, and now they took you guys, and, so maybe, there had to be people saying maybe Marduk is more powerful than God. This sounds like it could be something that they were actually saying. But Daniel, right from the start, we can see, right from the very start, made up his mind. He made up his mind. He was looking straight, long. He wasn't looking at what was going on right now because the evidence was there saying, this is a good deal, but maybe that wasn't good, and we've got a free ride. Come on, this is just the best thing that's in front of us. But he showed he wasn't going to play the game. He wasn't going to be used as evidence that Marduk was more than just a figment of imagination of the Babylonians. It's an important point. The only reason that we know this story is because of that Daniel, right from the start, made up his mind. Ahead of time, he made up his mind. He made up his mind before he knew how the story of Daniel was going to be, right? No one knew about this story, especially him. He was standing straight. He was upright. He was looking at ultimate over immediate. We've talked about that. Not focusing on what's right in front of him, which sure looks awfully like a good deal to me. If I was there, it'd be a tough, tough thing to weigh out, right? Not focusing focusing on right in front of him. And this again, like I said, this seemed like a great opportunity that looked really, really good, I'm sure, to a lot of people. But what he stood for was doing, if we remember, the right thing, no matter what the cost. Because the cost of this could have been, who knows, as we're going to read on here. And he stood for what he believed. He stood and showed that he was a man of integrity. Now, have we ever made up our minds? Have we really made up our minds on what direction our life is going to go? Or who we really want to be? Or in our society, is it more important to say this? One day at a time. We've heard that. One deal at a time. It's one opportunity at a time. It's one relationship at a time. And we make our decisions based on what the stock market did today or what the leaders of our nation said today. We are constantly changing our things. But if we was to make up our mind and let our integrity guide us, when we know what we ought to do, and not let the world out there push us around and say, this looks like a good deal, this doesn't look like a good deal. And even if it costs us, again, thinking of this, what's Daniel thinking about? These guys have been saying, what are you thinking about? Do you know what this is going to do to you? Do you know what could happen to you? If we was to stand up and do that, if there's a situation where we find ourselves in, we may also be writing a story that someday, even Daniel didn't know, but someday it might be worth telling. Well, it doesn't end there because we see Daniel continue to show integrity. And he's not just going to take, and the nice thing about this is we see that he asked the official, can I do this? He didn't say, well, I'm just not going to go ahead and eat this stuff, and the royal dogs or whatever. He's just going to take his plate and put it underneath the table and just feed it to them. He's going to stand up and be a man of integrity. Because remember, it says, but Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal foods and the wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself. He didn't care what's the cost here. I mean, you're going to go to the guy who could go tell the king what you're asking for, and who knows what could have happened. So he's above board. He's doing something that he knows is going to cost him, right? He didn't want to mislead or lie to the official or try to pull a fast one. He wanted to be, like I said, above board. And this could be considered that phrase we talked about, no matter what it costs. You know, and he didn't know the reaction of what this chief was going to be, did he? Well, no idea did he know. What could have gone wrong with this request?
Do I obey the king or do I die? And so the whole
That's what I
point
would've
for
thought.
Daniel is I am resolving to obey God. I am resolving because that food, not only was it offered to an idol, was also unclean by the law of Moses. All the guys knew that. So he had to decide if he was going to sin or he was not going to sin. Am I going to die or am I going to live? And I think wisdom for Daniel is asking for permission. I think he was resolved not to do it. But he chose to ask permission because that is a way in. That was the politically correct kind of way, and it's not the right word, but that was, when you are a good diplomat. So he was more diplomatic in how he chose to deal with that situation. Throughout his whole life, he chose to pray and do what he needed to do. Either I obey God or I sinned. And I think that's the whole issue with integrity.
You're exactly right. I mean, this shows, when we're talking about integrity, if you want to have a good definition of it, is doing this, you know. Would you try to do something with your boss? Would you go in and actually ask for permission to do something that you know that he possibly could say, you're out of here, you know? Yeah, definitely, you know. And like you said, it proves as we read the rest of the story through Daniel what type of man Daniel actually was. But in doing this, and this is something I think Daniel totally understood, but by doing this, he placed himself squarely in the hands of God and the mercy of God. Now remember, up to this point, have we seen anybody, does God come into this and said, Daniel, you know, an angel, don't eat the food, you know, don't drink the wine. You know, we've seen this where the angel has come to people, you know, like even to Mary, you know, Mary, realize you're gonna have a child here, you know. He told him what, you know, there's a lot of times we see angels intervene or come to someone and say, here's what it is, so go ahead and do it. But no, that he's actually just putting himself squarely at the mercy of God. And the one thing we remember, which Lan kind of brought up, you know, mercy was not in the Babylonian vocabulary, was it? And it certainly was not in Nebuchadnezzar's vocabulary, if he was to read through exactly what happened there. For Daniel, his only hope was for God to intervene, and God had not promised to intervene. Now, when we sacrifice our integrity, and we're all tempted to do this, it's human nature, to get that one thing that we don't think that we can get any other way, what we do is we close the door to the possibility of God intervening, don't we? When we close the door, we see that we've lost that time. We don't know what could have happened, because then we'll never know what God might have done if we just trust him. We'll never know the story that we would have the opportunity to tell if we close the door on that God moment. And now God moment is when you have done the right thing, when people know what you're doing, your boss, whoever that might be, and there's a potential price to be paid. And then God decides to intervene on your behalf. But, as we all know, there are no guarantees. You know, unlike the prosperity, type thing. You know, if you do this, this is going to happen. If you do this, no, that's not the way it is. You know, this is no guarantees. There's nothing in God's word and Christianity that says, well, if you just do this, then this is exactly going to happen. Now again, Daniel had no idea how this was going to work out. It would have been so much easier if God had just sent an angel, like we said, to Daniel, and told him, you know, don't eat that food. You know, don't drink that wine. God's going to take care of you. And wouldn't it be easier for us every time that we're put in a situation, you know, we get ready to sign that one thing that we were going to sign, and, you know, all of a sudden, you know, Don't do it. Don't do it. Wouldn't it be nice if that happened to us, right? Because we know there's really no guarantees, are there? But that's okay, because it's always better for us to place ourselves in the hands of God, whether guaranteed or not. It's always better for us to have interest. It's always best in our interest, even if it doesn't look like at that moment that God is going to help us. I don't know how many of you have read forward, or if you're even looking at your Bibles, but eventually, Daniel 1:9, now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. And it's kind of odd, because then he says, but the official told Daniel, look, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and your drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you. And this is one of those figures of speech that we've all heard. He's going to have my head if I do that. And what Andy said, this is probably where it came from, was right here, because it was literal back then. This guy probably seen that he probably had a place out on the palace where all these heads were people that didn't do exactly what he wanted. That's exactly what would happen if these guys didn't obey the king. He would just chop off their head and place it out there somewhere. So he said, again, the king would actually have my head because of you. Now, it's interesting because, again, we kind of see some real good integrity going on here. So for the sake of the official, Daniel knew of the possible ramifications that might happen. So he says this. Then Daniel said to the guard, whom was chief official that he appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So now we're going back to their Hebrew names. He says, please test your servants for 10 days. The others going, what? What? So he probably talked to them about this too. He's not just saying, that, did they buy in on this as well? Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. How many of you here are on a vegetable diet? Then compare our appearance with that of the young man who eat all the royal meat. That's when they say royal food, is mostly probably meats of all different types. That was what they were really big on, and again, the real heavy wines most likely. And then to treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to do this, and he tested them for 10 days. And at the end of the 10th day, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice of food and the wine, and they drank and gave them nothing but vegetables instead. Vegetarians, watch out. And then we end up with this. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of the literature and the learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all of the magicians and enchanters in this whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Does anybody know how long it was between the first year of King Cyrus? Roughly? 70 years. 70 years. Now what was the one thing you think that Daniel exhibited that allowed him to be so trusted and regarded in that whole time? If we think of one word, integrity, right? Nebuchadnezzar came and gone, Darius came and he went, and then became Cyrus. So he gave counsel and direction to all 3 of those kings and was, revered. He was respected. Through all of that. So remember, we see him when he started out when he was 17 years old. So, kind of a different story from last week's, don't we think? With Esau. Well, that's all we have time for today. And we will pick up probably maybe with another story of Daniel a little bit later on next week. So let's go ahead and have a quick prayer. Dear wonderful God, we want to thank you so much for your goodness, your glory, for your love and caring, for how you bless us each and every day of your lives, and how your blessings are new every morning. And we thank you for this day that we can come together and worship you, read more of your word, understand more of your goodness. Help us, dear Father, to be Christ-like in all that we do today. Let your Spirit lead us and guide us as we continue on through this day and through the rest of this week. And it's in Christ's name we do pray. Amen.